What happens when the ghosts of war aren't on the battlefield, but waiting for you back home, disguised as your closest friend? For American veteran John Callahan, a single brittle envelope would ignite a 50-year-old ember, threatening to burn down the very foundations of his life. The air in John Callahan's workshop was a cathedral of quiet smells: sawdust, sharp and clean from a fresh cut of pine, the metallic tang of lubricating oil, the faint, sweet perfume of wood varnish. These were the scents of his peace, the aromas of a life, carefully constructed, board by board, nail by nail, over the course of 5 decades. At 72, his hands, though knotted with the stubborn defiance of arthritis, still moved with the steady, measured grace of a man who understood his tools. They were hands that had built rocking chairs for his neighbor's grandchildren, repaired faulty wiring, and coaxed stubborn engines back to life. They were good hands, honest hands, but today they trembled. On the workbench, next to a half-finished birdhouse whose tiny, perfect joints were a testament to his patience, lay the past. It had arrived in 2 forms. The first, a photograph, its corners soft and its surface webbed with the fine cracks of age. It showed a young woman, her hair a cascade of black silk against the simple collar of an au dai. Her smile was a quiet rebellion, a small, defiant beacon of light in the monochrome gray of a world on fire. John hadn't needed the photograph to remember her face. It was etched onto the back of his eyelids, a ghost printed on silver halide that he saw every time he closed his eyes. Beside it lay the second piece of the past, the catalyst, an airmail envelope, thin as a communion wafer and just as holy. It was impossibly fragile, the paper yellowed and brittle, as if the humidity of its origin had clung to it for a 50-year journey across an ocean of time. The postmark was a ghost from another world, Ho Chi Minh City, a name his mind still refused to accept, a surgical revision of the city he knew, Saigon. For 50 years, the memory of her, of Mai, was a fire he'd learned to bank. It was a controlled burn, a smoldering ember of guilt and profound, unending loss he kept contained within the firebreak of his quiet, orderly life. He would go to the VFW hall on Fridays, share a beer with men who understood the language of silence, and never, ever speak her name. The fall of Saigon wasn't just a chapter in a history book for John. It was a sound, a deafening, world-ending roar that had ripped his universe in 2, leaving only smoke, the scent of cordite, and a whispered promise he had failed to keep. He'd been told she was gone, lost in the chaos, swallowed by the city as it fell. He had accepted it, because he had to. He had buried that part of himself under layers of routine and responsibility, and on the ashes of that promise, he had built this quiet life, this workshop, this peace. But the letter, it was a shovel digging through the ash. He had stared at the envelope for a full hour before his trembling fingers had managed to tear it open. The script inside was spidery, unfamiliar, written in careful, deliberate English. It wasn't from her, but it spoke of her. And then, it spoke of the impossible. A secret she had carried, a secret that had somehow survived. The letter spoke of a son. His son, Hong. The name was a foreign object in his mind, a word he hadn't dared to speak, not even to himself, in half a century. He had quarantined it in the deepest, most fortified part of his soul, because to acknowledge the name was to acknowledge the loss. But here it was, typed neatly on a thin sheet of paper. Your son, Hung, is looking for you. The carefully constructed piece of his world didn't just crack. It detonated. The scent of pine and oil vanished, replaced by the phantom smell of jungle rot and diesel fumes. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the house was drowned out by the thwump 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 of Huey helicopter blades. Through the shattered walls of his carefully built present, the jungles of Vietnam began to reclaim him. This wasn't just a letter. It was a summons, a voice from a life he had been assured was long dead and buried. He sank onto his workshop stool, the wood groaning under his weight. He looked at his hands, these hands that had built a life of peace, and saw the ghosts of the hands that had held a rifle, the hands that had held hers for the very last time. The past was no longer a memory. It was here. It was sitting on his workbench, and it was demanding an answer. The search had just begun, but the most devastating battle was one he never saw coming. To follow John's journey into the heart of a forgotten promise, make sure you subscribe to Echoes of the Past. The groan of the workshop stool under his weight dissolved. The scent of pine and varnish evaporated. The solid, reassuring presence of the four walls he had built around his life, they melted away like smoke, and the past, no longer a phantom, rushed in to fill the vacuum. He wasn't a silver-haired grandfather, hunched over a memory. He was 22 again, a Marine with the salt sting of fear in his eyes and the hand of a terrified girl in his. The Saigon of his memory wasn't a glittering metropolis. It was an oven, a pressure cooker. It was April 1975, and the city was holding its breath, waiting for the final mortal blow. The air, thick enough to drink, was a suffocating cocktail of humidity, of uncollected garbage, of fear, sweat, and the cloying, sweet perfume of frangipani blossoms, a scent he would forever associate with the end of the world. He and Mai weren't on a quiet veranda. They were pressed against a tide of humanity, a desperate, surging sea of bodies breaking against the cold concrete walls of the American embassy. The wall was a symbol, the last bastion of a broken promise. And the sky above it, it wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound that had become the city's frantic heartbeat. The percussive, deafening thwump, 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 thwump of Huey helicopter blades, beating the thick air into submission. They were angels of deliverance for a chosen few, and vultures for the rest. Every face in the crowd was a portrait of desperation. Men in suits, their composure shredded, screaming at the guards. Mothers, their faces, masks of anguish, holding their children aloft as if offering them to a merciless God. It was a symphony of chaos. And in the middle of it all was Mai. She was so small, so fragile in the crush. Her hand in his was a tiny, trembling bird. He tried to shield her with his body, a futile gesture against the weight of a collapsing nation. Her eyes, those dark, endless pools of quiet strength that had first captivated him in a bustling market a year ago, were now wide with a terror that mirrored his own. "They'll get us through, Mai," he had yelled, his voice raw, trying to force a confidence he didn't feel. "We have papers. They know you're with me." She just shook her head. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement. She knew. In that moment, she was wiser than him. She knew the papers meant nothing, that his uniform meant nothing, that the promises of a great nation meant nothing when the gates were closing. He felt the pull then, a hand on his shoulder. A fellow Marine, his face grim. "Callahan, let's go! It's our bird, now!" Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He tightened his grip on her hand. No, we're together. But the tide was too strong. He was being pulled back, dragged toward the gate, toward the helicopter, toward survival. She was being left behind. He saw the understanding dawn on her face, the final, heartbreaking acceptance of her fate. Their fate. "I'll come back for you, Mai!" he screamed, the words tearing from his throat, a desperate vow against the roar of the rotors and the cries of the dying city. "I promise. You and the baby. I promise." She didn't cry. Her strength, it shamed him. With her free hand, she reached into the small cloth bag at her side and pulled something out. She pressed it into his palm, her small hand covering his, forcing his fingers to close around it. It was a bird, carved from a piece of dark, fragrant wood. Its wings were outstretched, poised for a flight it would never take. Her eyes met his, and in their depths he saw not an accusation, but a final, desperate plea. "Be careful, my John," she whispered, her voice a fragile, beautiful sound that was instantly swallowed by the maelstrom. And then, she was gone. The crowd surged, and his last image of her was a flash of her white Audi, a ghost being consumed by the chaos. He was hauled through the gate, up the ramp, and into the belly of the machine. As the helicopter lifted off, banking sharply over the city, he looked down, but he couldn't see her. He could only see the smoke, rising from a dozen different fires, blanketing the city in a gray, funereal shroud. He held the wooden bird so tightly, its sharp edges cut into his palm. It was all he had left. Weeks later, the chaos of Saigon was replaced by the sterile, bureaucratic limbo of a processing center on Guam. The air here wasn't thick with fear, it was thin and empty. John felt like a ghost, drifting through endless lines, filling out endless forms. He was a body without a soul. His soul was still back there, in a smoke-filled city, searching for a girl in a white dress. Then he saw him. Frank Kowalski, his best friend, his brother. Frank's face, usually a mask of cynical humor and easy confidence, was grim. He walked over to John, his boots echoing on the linoleum floor. He didn't say hello. He just put a heavy hand on John's shoulder, his grip like steel. "Johnny," he started, his voice low. "I'm sorry." John's blood ran cold. "What? Did you find her? Frank, did you hear anything?" Frank took a deep breath, his eyes refusing to meet John's. He stared at a point on the wall just past John's ear. "I asked around, man. The guys who came out on the last birds. I gave them her address, her neighborhood." He paused, and in that pause, John's world ended for a second time. There was a firefight, right on her street, a VC patrol cleaning house. Frank's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, like a field report. "It was bad, Johnny. House to house. No one made it out." The words were clean, surgical. They didn't rip or tear, they just excised something from inside him. A hope he hadn't even known was still alive. John didn't break. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just felt something inside him collapse, turning instantly to ash. The world, which had been a cacophony of terror and noise, went completely silent. The colors faded from the room, leaving only shades of gray. Frank's grip on his shoulder tightened. "I'm sorry, buddy. God, I'm so sorry." He stayed by John's side that day, and for all the empty days that followed. Frank was the one who got him to eat. Frank was the one who sat with him through the long, silent nights. Frank was the one who navigated the paperwork, who got them both on a flight back to a country that no longer felt like home. Through the long, empty years that followed, Frank was his anchor, the only fixed point in a drifting, meaningless world. He was the keeper of their shared past, the only other person on earth who knew the name Mai. He was the brother John had chosen, the man he trusted more than anyone, and he was the man who had confirmed that John's life, the one that truly mattered, had ended in fire and smoke on a forgotten street in a fallen city 50 years ago. 50 years later, they sat in that same diner, in that same booth. The red vinyl of the seat was cracked in the exact same places John remembered from a decade ago, and probably the decade before that. The air still hung thick with the smell of stale coffee and sizzling bacon grease, a smell that hadn't changed in 5 decades. It was their place, a time capsule of cheap coffee and unspoken understandings. For 50 years, this booth had been their confessional, their command center, their refuge. It was here they had planned Frank's first wedding. Here they had mourned the passing of John's parents. Here they had sat in comfortable silence for hours on end. 2 old soldiers who had seen the end of a world and had no words left to describe it. John's hands, the ones that had been trembling in his workshop, were now wrapped around a thick ceramic mug of coffee. He stared into the black liquid, watching the steam rise like a ghost. He had been quiet for 10 minutes. Frank, ever patient, simply waited. He knew the rhythms of his friend's moods better than anyone. He knew this wasn't a comfortable silence. It was the heavy, charged silence that comes before a storm. Finally, John looked up. His eyes, usually a calm, steady gray, were turbulent. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn denim jacket and pulled out the envelope. He didn't toss it onto the table. He placed it there, carefully, as if it were a sacred relic or a live grenade. He slid it across the sticky vinyl surface, the sound a faint, dry whisper. Frank looked from John's face to the envelope. He saw the faded airmail markings, the foreign postmark. He didn't touch it immediately. He just looked at John, his brow furrowed with a deep, protective concern. "Johnny, what's this?" "Just read it, Frank." John's voice was a low rasp. Frank picked up the letter with a caution usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. His eyes, blue and faded like old denim, scanned the page, once, then twice. John watched every micro-expression that flickered across his friend's face. He saw the initial confusion, which deepened into shock. He saw Frank's jaw tighten. He saw the muscles in his neck cord. When Frank finally put the letter down, he looked older, weighed down. He leaned forward, his voice low and urgent, the way it used to get on patrol when he sensed trouble. "John, this has to be a scam." His words were not dismissive, they were gentle, reasonable. The voice of a friend trying to pull another back from a cliff's edge. "Somebody found your name, dug up your old service records. It's a whole industry over there now, preying on guys like us, on old men's grief. They're looking for money, Johnny. That's all this island." John just shook his head slowly. "It feels real, Frank." "Of course it feels real," Frank insisted, his voice still a careful whisper. "They're professionals. They know what to say. They know what buttons to push." He tapped the letter with a thick finger. "Think about it. 50 years. 50 years and not a word. Why now?" "It doesn't make sense." He leaned back, letting out a long, weary sigh, the picture of a man burdened by his friend's pain. "Let it go, buddy. Please. Don't do this to yourself. Don't go chasing ghosts." The word ghosts, it hung in the air between them. It was the same word John had used to describe his own life. For a moment, doubt, cold and familiar, seeped back in. Frank was right. It didn't make sense. It was a desperate fantasy, a cruel trick played on a lonely old man. He had almost reached out to pull the letter back, to crumple it in his hand and throw it away, to return to the quiet, manageable pain of his life. But then he remembered the other thing, the thing he hadn't shown Frank yet. His hand went back into his jacket pocket. This time, it came out with a small, cracked photograph. He slid it across the table, placing it directly on top of the letter. Frank's eyes fell to the picture. His practiced, reasonable expression faltered. For just a split second, John saw something else in his friend's eyes. A flicker of something that looked like panic. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced again by careful concern. "She's older, of course," John said, his voice finding a new strength. "But it's her, Frank. You see it, don't you? It's Mai." He pointed a trembling finger at the infant in her arms. The baby, wrapped in a simple cloth, was staring directly at the camera. "And that's him. That's the boy. Look at his eyes, Frank. Just look at his eyes." They were John's eyes. There was no mistaking it. That same shade of gray, that same serious, steady gaze, even in the face of an infant. Frank stared at the photograph for a long time. The sounds of the diner, the clatter of plates, the low murmur of conversations, they all faded into a dull roar. Finally, he looked up, and he had his composure back. He shook his head, a look of profound pity on his face. "Johnny, they can fake anything these days. Photoshop, deep fakes, you know that. It's easy to get an old picture of you, an old picture of her, and create this. It's what they do. They create the perfect bait." But John wasn't listening anymore. He was looking at the photograph of his son. It wasn't bait. It wasn't a ghost. It was real. And in that moment, a 50-year-old promise, a promise made in the heart of a hurricane, roared back to life. "It's not a ghost, Frank," he said, his voice low and clear with a certainty that startled them both. "It's my son, and I'm going to find him." Against Frank's final, desperate pleas, John booked the flight. The moment he stepped out of the air-conditioned sterility of Tan Son Nhut International Airport, the past slammed into him like a physical blow. It was the air. That was the first thing. The air hadn't changed. It was a solid thing. A wet, heavy blanket you had to push your way through. It carried the same smells he remembered. The sweet, cloying scent of strange blossoms. The acrid bite of diesel exhaust. The rich, savory aroma of street food cooking over charcoal. And the underlying, earthy smell of impending rain. He stood on the curb, an old man in a new world, as the city roared around him. But this wasn't the city he remembered. The Saigon of his memory was a city of bicycles, of military jeeps, of cyclos and low French colonial buildings, their pastel paint peeling in the humidity. This was something else entirely. A river. An endless, thundering river of motorbikes, thousands of them, flowed past him in a chaotic, yet somehow graceful, ballet. They carried everything. Whole families of 4, crates of chickens, panes of glass, towering stacks of wicker baskets. And beyond the river of bikes, the city itself had been reborn. Shimmering towers of glass and steel pierced the hazy sky, their logos, Samsung, Prudential, Canon, blazing like the banners of a conquering army. The scarred, pockmarked city he had fled was gone. In its place was a glittering, roaring, unapologetic beast of commerce and forward momentum. He felt a profound and dizzying sense of vertigo. He was a ghost, a relic from a buried layer of this city's history, now unearthed and left blinking in a future he was never meant to see. He was searching for a memory in a city that had chosen to forget. And as he hailed a taxi, the driver, a kid no older than 20, with earbuds in and a smartphone mounted on his dash, John felt a crushing sense of hopelessness. He was a man out of time, on a fool's errand, chasing a promise everyone, even his best friend, believed was long dead. The taxi, a modern, air-conditioned Toyota, was an alien bubble of cool, quiet comfort moving through the vibrant, sweltering chaos of the city. John sat in the back seat, the leather cool against his skin, and felt the profound dislocation of a time traveler. He gave the driver the address from the letter, the words feeling clumsy and thick in his mouth, a relic of a language he hadn't spoken in half a century. The driver just nodded, tapped the address into a navigation app on his phone, and pulled out into the thundering river of motorbikes. They drove for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 20 minutes. They moved from the wide, tree-lined boulevards of the city center, with their luxury brand stores and gleaming hotel lobbies, into a different city, a tighter, more intimate city. The streets narrowed, the buildings grew closer together, their upper floors tangled in a chaotic web of electrical wires that hung so low they looked like jungle vines. This was closer to the Saigon he remembered. The sounds and smells intensified. The roar of the traffic was now punctuated by the cries of street vendors, the sizzle of cooking oil, the faint, tinny sound of music drifting from an open doorway. The taxi finally slowed and stopped at the mouth of an alley. The driver pointed. "In there, sir. No car." John paid him, his old American hands fumbling with the colorful, unfamiliar currency. He stepped out of the car, and the city enveloped him. The alley was a canyon carved between crumbling, 4-story buildings. It was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of noodle stalls, tiny, family-run shops selling everything from cell phone chargers to live eels and makeshift homes whose front doors opened directly into the bustling life of the alley. The air was thick with the steam from giant pots of pho, with the scent of incense burning at a small street-side altar, with the laughter of children kicking a worn-out soccer ball. He clutched the letter in his hand, a fragile map in a world he no longer recognized. The address had described a small apartment building, number 14B, with a green door. He walked slowly, his heart a heavy, rhythmic drum against his ribs. He counted the numbers, 10, 12, 14. He stopped. Where 14B should have been, there was no green door. There was no apartment building. There was only the bright, modern storefront of a small coffee shop. The daily grind, the sign read in cheerful Western-style script. Inside, he could see young people hunched over laptops, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of their screens. The smell of freshly ground espresso, wafted out. A scent as out of place here as he was. A wave of dizziness washed over him. He leaned against a wall for support. The rough, sun-warmed concrete, a small, solid comfort. A scam. Frank's voice, so reasonable, so certain, echoed in his head. They create the perfect bait, Johnny. Had it all been a lie? Had he crossed an ocean, chasing a phantom address? He had to be sure. He took a deep breath, pushed open the glass door of the coffee shop, and stepped inside. The cool, air-conditioned quiet was a shock after the sensory overload of the alley. A young woman behind the counter with brightly colored hair and a friendly smile looked up. "Xin Chao, welcome." John approached the counter slowly. He held out the letter. He didn't have the words in Vietnamese to explain. He just pointed to the address, and then at the space where they now stood. "Here?" he asked, his voice rough. "An apartment? A green door?" The young woman looked at the letter, her brow furrowed in concentration. She shook her head. "No, sir. My family. We built this shop 5 years ago. Before that, an old building. Very old. They tear it down." She smiled. A polite, apologetic smile. "Sorry. I don't know." He had to ask. He pulled out the photograph of Mai and the baby. His hand was shaking again. He held it out to her. "This woman, or this boy, did you ever see them? Do you know this family?" She studied the photograph with genuine interest. But she just shook her head again, her expression soft with pity for this old lost American. "No, sir, I'm sorry, it's a very old picture." He thanked her, turned, and walked back out into the suffocating heat of the alley. Defeat, cold and heavy, settled in his gut. For the next 2 weeks, John chased shadows. He became a fixture in the city's parks. A strange, solitary old American showing a faded photograph to the old men who gathered every morning to play chess and do their slow, graceful Tai Chi exercises. They would look at the photo, their eyes cloudy with their own memories, and they would shake their heads. Some offered him tea. Some told him stories of the war, but no one knew her. He wandered through the sprawling, chaotic markets, showing the picture to the matriarchs, who sat enthroned behind pyramids of exotic fruits and mountains of fresh herbs. They were kind. They saw the desperation in his eyes. They offered him theories. She probably married a party official and moved to Hanoi. Many girls like her escaped on the boats to Malaysia or Thailand. Perhaps she was sent to a re-education camp. Many did not come back. Each story was a new knife, twisting in an old wound. His hope, which had burned so brightly in that American diner, was now just a flicker. A tiny, starving flame threatening to be extinguished by the sheer, overwhelming indifference of time. He was an archaeologist, digging for a single, specific bone in a city that was one vast, unmarked grave. The weight of his age, of the 50 years he had lost, pressed down on him with a physical force. He walked slower. The humidity seemed to steal the breath from his lungs. The city, once a place of vibrant, youthful memory, was now just a monument to his failure. Frank's words, they were a constant, taunting refrain in his head. "You're chasing ghosts, Johnny. Let it go." He was in a park near the old presidential palace, now called the Reunification Palace. He was sitting on a bench, staring at the photograph for the 1,000th time, preparing to admit defeat. He had booked a flight home for the next morning. It was over. Frank was right. He had chased a ghost and lost. An old woman, her back bent into a permanent question mark from a lifetime of hard work, shuffled up to his bench. Her face was a beautiful, intricate roadmap of wrinkles, each line a story. She was selling lottery tickets from a small tray that hung around her neck. "Move so dion," she rasped, her voice like the sound of dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Buy a lottery ticket, sir." On impulse, John didn't buy a ticket. He just held out the photograph. It was his last futile gesture. "I'm looking for this woman," he said in his broken Vietnamese, "or her son." The old woman squinted, her eyes cloudy with cataracts. She took the photograph from him, her hand surprisingly steady. She held it close to her face. He expected the same slow shake of the head, the same look of pity. But she didn't shake her head. She went completely still. She wasn't looking at Mai's face. She was looking at the baby. More specifically, she was looking at the small object clutched in the baby's tiny hand, the wooden bird. She pointed a crooked, bony finger at it. "Kaine," she whispered. "This thing." She looked up at John, her cloudy eyes suddenly sharp with a distant memory. "My brother," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "He carved birds like this. Just like this." It was his signature. John's heart, which had been a heavy, leaden thing in his chest, suddenly lurched. "Your brother? Where is he? Can I talk to him?" The old woman's face fell. "He passed on many years ago. After the war, life was very hard for him. He moved away from the city to a small fishing village near Da Nang." She paused, her mind working slowly, pulling a thread from the tangled spool of the past. "But his wife, my sister-in-law, she's still there. She runs a small guest house now, for the tourists." The old woman looked from the bird in the picture to John's face. "She has a good memory. She may remember." It was the first solid thing he had held on to in weeks. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a theory. It was a connection, a single, fragile thread in a hopeless 50-year-old tangle. But it didn't lead him back to the alleys of Saigon. It led him north, hundreds of miles away. It led him toward a new city, and to a part of his past he could have never, in his wildest dreams, expected to find. The journey north was a journey through time. John took a train. Not the sleek, silent bullet trains of Europe or Japan, but a rumbling, rhythmic, living machine that felt like a relic of another era. It clattered its way up the coast, a steel serpent winding through a landscape of impossible green. For 2 days, he sat by a grimy window and watched Vietnam unfold. He saw emerald green rice paddies, stretching to the horizon like a vast, shimmering quilt tended by solitary figures in conical hats, their movements slow and ancient. He saw water buffalo, their hides the color of wet slate, submerged up to their necks in muddy pools, placid and unmoving as stones. He saw ramshackle villages flash by, a blur of corrugated tin roofs and vibrant laundry flapping in the breeze. And he saw the ocean, a constant, brilliant slash of turquoise on his right, dotted with the bright colors of small fishing boats. This was the country he had only ever seen from the belly of a helicopter or through the narrow sights of a rifle. He had fought in its jungles, bled on its soil, but he had never truly seen it. The profound, heartbreaking beauty of it all, it settled in his chest like a quiet, aching grief for a peace he had never known here. He felt the hope in him, which had been a fragile, flickering thing, begin to steady, to grow. The thread the old lottery ticket seller had given him, it felt stronger now, more real. He was no longer chasing a ghost in a haunted city. He was following a map, a real map, to a real place. Da Nang was another surprise. The city he remembered as a sprawling, chaotic American airbase, a place of dust and sandbags, and the constant scream of jet engines, had also been reborn. It was now a modern, booming coastal resort. Sleek, high-rise hotels lined a pristine beachfront, their glass facades reflecting the brilliant blue of the South China Sea. Tourists, sunburned and smiling, thronged the streets. John didn't linger. He found a driver, a quiet, middle-aged man named Bao, who knew the coastal roads. He showed Bao the name of the village the old woman had written down for him, and the name of the guest house. The Onbin guest house, the peaceful guest house. Bao nodded, his expression unreadable, and they drove away from the city's frantic energy. The village, when they finally arrived, was a world away. It clung to a small, protected cove, the sand a perfect crescent of white against the turquoise water. Life here moved to a different rhythm, not the frantic, high-pitched hum of the city, but the slow, deep, eternal rhythm of the tides. The air smelled of salt, and drying fish, and blooming bougainvillea. Bao pointed toward the far end of the cove. There, set apart from the more modest village houses, was a structure that didn't seem to belong. It wasn't a guest house in the way John had imagined. Not a simple, rustic collection of bungalows. It was an elegant two-story villa, built in a modern, minimalist style. Its white walls were clean and sharp against the lush green of the hillside behind it. Walls of glass looked out over the sea. It was a place of serene, understated luxury. A piece of Malibu or the French Riviera dropped onto the coast of central Vietnam. A profound sense of unease, of dissonance, began to creep over John. This wasn't right. "This is it?" John asked, his voice hesitant. Bao nodded. "In Bin. Very famous. Very expensive." John paid the driver, and with a heart that had begun to beat a slow, heavy, uncertain rhythm, he walked up the stone pathway that led to the villa's entrance. The pathway was lined with fragrant, white frangipani trees, the same flowers whose scent had filled the air on the day Saigon fell. He didn't have to knock. As if sensing his approach, the large, dark wood door swung open. A woman emerged and stepped into the sunlight. And in that moment, John Callahan's world, which had been ripped apart once in 1975, and again on a small grave he hadn't yet seen, was ripped apart for a third and final time. She was not a simple village woman. She was not the sister-in-law of a poor woodcarver. She was dressed not in a peasant's tunic, but in a tailored sleeveless silk dress the color of cream. A single perfect pearl hung from a thin gold chain around her neck. Her hair, once a sheet of black silk, was now cut in a chic, modern bob, with elegant streaks of silver at her temples. Her bearing was regal, composed. She carried herself with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who was in complete command of her world. Time had been kind to her, but it had also been there. It had etched fine, delicate lines around her eyes and mouth, lines that spoke of laughter, yes, but also of sorrow and of a strength forged in fire. But it was her. He would have known that face in the darkest night, in the thickest fog, at the end of the world. It was Mai. The shock was not a thought. It was a physical blow. It felt as if the air had been punched from his lungs. His knees weakened. He stumbled for words. The carefully rehearsed Vietnamese phrases he had practiced, they evaporated from his mind, leaving only a dry, useless clicking in his throat. Mai? The name was a breath, a question, a prayer. She looked at him. Her face was a perfect, placid mask, but her eyes were a different story. In their dark depths, he saw a universe of emotions swirl and collide. He saw shock. He saw pain. He saw a flicker of something that might have been old affection. But mostly, he saw a profound, deep, and ancient anger. She did not rush to him. She did not cry his name. She simply stood there, watching him, as if he were a ghost who had wandered out of the sea. "I was told," he finally managed to stammer, his voice a stranger's in his own ears. "They told me you were dead?" She finished the sentence for him. Her voice was calm. It was smooth as the silk she wore, but underneath that calm, there was an edge of cold, hard steel that he had never heard before. "As you can see, John," she said, his name sounding alien on her lips, "the rumors were exaggerated. There was no warmth in her reunion. There was no tearful embrace. There was only this guarded, glacial distance. It was a chasm, 50 years wide, and he had no idea how to cross it." She gestured toward the house. "You have come a long way. You should have some tea." It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. He followed her dumbly, like a sleepwalker. He followed her through the cool, elegant interior of the villa, a world of polished stone floors and minimalist art, to a wide, shaded veranda that overlooked the ocean. The silence between them was immense. An ocean in itself filled only with the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing on the shore below. Finally, after an eternity, he found his voice. He had to ask the question, the only question that mattered, the question that had carried him across the world and back through time. "Our son," he began, his voice cracking. "Hung, the letter. It said he was looking for me. Is he here?" The question, his question, it hung in the air between them, suspended in the salty, humid breeze that drifted in from the sea. It was the only thing in the world. The sun, the sky, the rhythmic crash of the waves on the shore below, all of it faded into a muted, distant backdrop. There was only his desperate, trembling hope and her answer. Mai's face, that perfect, placid mask she wore like a shield, finally fractured. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible. The corner of her mouth tightened, a muscle in her jaw flickered, and in her eyes, in those dark, guarded eyes, he saw a flicker of ancient, unhealed pain. It was a pain so deep, so profound, it seemed to pull the light from the air around her. She didn't look at him. She looked out at the horizon, at the endless, indifferent blue of the ocean. For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. He thought she would simply let his question dissolve into the vast, eternal silence of the sea. But then, she spoke. And her voice, when it came, was different. The cold steel edge was gone. It was replaced by something softer, something impossibly weary. "Hung," she said, her voice just a whisper, almost carried away by the breeze. "Yes, he is here." The words. They were simple, just 4 simple words. But for John, they were the end of a 50-year war. They were a pardon, an absolution. The immense, crushing weight of guilt he had carried on his shoulders for his entire adult life. The weight of a broken promise, of a life abandoned. It didn't just lessen, it vanished. It was as if a physical burden had been lifted from him, and he felt so light he thought he might float away. A wave of relief so powerful it was dizzying washed over him. He had to grip the arm of his chair to steady himself. He's here. He's alive. His son is alive. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in his eyes. He didn't try to stop them. They were 50 years of unshed grief. 50 years of regret. 50 years of a loneliness so profound, he had forgotten what it felt like not to be alone. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, in 1,000 different ways. A hesitant handshake, a difficult, stilted conversation, an angry confrontation. But in every version, it ended with a reunion. It ended with him looking into the face of his son. "Can I?" he started, his voice thick, choked with emotion. "Can I see him?" Mai turned from the sea then and looked at him. Really looked at him. And in her eyes he saw not anger, but a deep, bottomless pity. It was a look that unsettled him, that sent a tiny, cold splinter of unease through the warmth of his relief. She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, her voice still a soft, sad whisper. "You can see him." She stood up, the silk of her dress making a faint, rustling sound. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she were moving through water. "Come," she said, "I will take you to him." He stood up too quickly, his legs unsteady beneath him. A lifetime of anticipation, of dread and hope, was about to culminate in the next few moments. He expected her to lead him back into the house, to a bedroom perhaps, where a man his son's age might be waiting. He braced himself. What would he say? What could he possibly say to a son whose life he had been absent from? "Hello, I'm your father. I'm sorry I'm 50 years late." The thought was terrifying, but it was a good terror. A terror born of hope. But she didn't lead him into the house. She turned and walked toward a set of stone steps that led down from the veranda into a manicured tropical garden. He followed, a cold, creeping confusion beginning to replace the euphoria. The garden was beautiful. Paths of smooth gray river stones wound through lush beds of ferns and exotic, brilliantly colored flowers. The air was thick with the sweet, heavy perfume of jasmine and ginger blossoms. It was a place of profound peace, a place of quiet contemplation. She led him through the garden, her steps silent on the stone path. She didn't look back. She just kept walking toward a small, quiet clearing at the far end of the property. The clearing was shaded by a large, ancient frangipani tree, its gnarled branches heavy with fragrant white blossoms. And there, in the center of the clearing, bathed in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the leaves, stood a single piece of stone. It wasn't a statue or a bench. It was a headstone. Simple, white, marble. John stopped. His feet felt as if they had been nailed to the path. The world, which had just been so full of color and sound and hope, began to tilt on its axis. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't process what he was seeing. It wasn't possible. Mai stopped beside the headstone. She reached out and gently brushed a fallen leaf from its surface. Her back was to him. He forced his legs to move. One step, then another. Each step was a monumental effort, a journey across a landscape of shattering hope. As he drew closer, he could see the name, etched into the smooth, polished marble, in both Vietnamese and English, Nguyen An Hung, and beneath the name were the dates. 1975, 1980, 5 years old. The numbers didn't make sense. They were a foreign language, a code he couldn't decipher. He stared at them, willing them to change, to rearrange themselves into a different, less terrible truth. But they remained, unmoving, immutable. He had come all this way. He had crossed an ocean. He had followed a thread of impossible hope, and it had all led to this, a cold, silent piece of stone. He was a beautiful boy, Mai said softly, her voice thick now with the tears she had held back for 45 years. He had your eyes, John, the same serious gaze. He was so smart, so full of life. She finally turned to face him. Her face was no longer a mask. It was a canvas of pure, unadulterated grief. But the years after the war, they were hard, so hard. There was no food, no medicine, the blockade. Her voice broke. She took a shuddering breath. A fever. Just a simple fever. It came on so fast. There was nothing I could do. Nothing. John stared at the small grave. The world dissolved around him. The vibrant colors of the garden bled into a uniform, soundless gray. The fragrant air grew thin and cold. The crushing weight of guilt, the weight he thought had been lifted, came crashing back down on him, 1,000 times heavier than before. It was his fault. If he had been here, if he hadn't left, if he had kept his promise, his son might have lived. The journey was over. The impossible hope sparked by a single miraculous letter, it hadn't led to a reunion. It had led to a funeral, 50 years too late. There was nothing left. There was no one to find. The fire he had carried in his heart for half a century, the smoldering ember of Mai and their son, was finally, truly out. And there was nothing left but cold, bitter smoke. The flight back to America was a journey through a gray and silent purgatory. John sat by the window of the Boeing 787, a marvel of modern engineering soaring at 30,000 feet, but he saw nothing. The endless, brilliant blue of the sky, the magnificent architecture of the clouds below. It was all just a meaningless, muted blur. The man who had boarded the flight in Saigon, a man electrified by a fragile, terrifying hope, had died in a garden by the sea. The man now returning was a hollow shell, an echo. He didn't remember the meal service. He didn't remember the movies playing on the screen in front of him. He just sat and stared. He saw the headstone, the name, the dates, 1975 to 1980. The numbers were branded onto his memory now, a permanent, searing scar. He had found his son, only to lose him all over again, in a way that was infinitely more cruel. He had spent one more day at Mai's villa, a day of stilted, heartbreaking conversation. They had sat on that same veranda, two strangers who had once shared a universe, now separated by an ocean of time and unspoken grief. She had shown him a small, tattered album with a few precious photographs. A baby with his eyes, wrapped in a blanket. A toddler, taking his first steps on a dirt path. A little boy, no older than 4, with a shy, gap-toothed smile. His son. A ghost in sepia. Each photograph was a fresh torment, a glimpse into a life he had been denied, a life his son had been denied. There was no anger left in her, only a profound, bone-deep weariness. There was no anger left in him, either, only a vast, empty ache. They had said their goodbyes at her door. There was no embrace. Just a quiet, formal nod between two people who had lost too much to ever find their way back to each other. "Be well, John," she had said. And he had simply nodded, unable to speak. He landed at LAX in a daze. The noise and energy of the airport, the crush of people rushing to their own reunions, was a physical assault. He felt transparent. A ghost, moving through a world of the living. He found a quiet corner, a deserted waiting area, and pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over the contacts list. There was only one person he could call. One person who would understand. He pressed the button for Frank. It rang twice. Then his friend's voice, warm, familiar, and filled with concern, came on the line. "Johnny, you back? Where are you?" John leaned his head back against the cool glass of the airport window. He closed his eyes. His voice, when he finally found it, was hollow, a sound from a deep, empty well. "I'm back, Frank, at LAX. How'd it go, buddy?" Frank's voice was hesitant, gentle. John took a ragged breath. The words felt like shards of glass in his throat. "You were right, Frank," he said, the admission a bitter surrender. "You were right all along. It was all for nothing." He could hear the echo of his own desolate voice in the quiet of the empty waiting area. The boy hung. He died. Years ago, when he was just a little kid. On the other end of the line, there was a sharp intake of breath. It was a small sound, almost inaudible. But John heard it. It was followed by a silence. A long, profound silence. It stretched for 3 seconds, then 4, then 5. It wasn't the silence of someone searching for the right words. It felt different. It was a heavy, weighted silence. The silence of a man holding his breath. Finally, Frank's voice returned, thick now with a carefully crafted sympathy. "Oh, Johnny," he said, his voice heavy with pity. "God, I'm so sorry. I am so sorry." He sighed, a long, weary sound. "I wish you hadn't put yourself through that, man. I really do. I told you not to go chasing." He caught himself before he could say the word ghosts. "Listen, just come on home, okay? I'll be here for you. We'll have a beer. We'll get through this." "Yeah," John whispered. "Okay, Frank." He ended the call. He sat there for another hour, letting the silence from the phone call echo in his mind. Something was wrong. Something was off. The sharp intake of breath. The long, weighted pause. He couldn't shake it. He told himself he was just raw, that his grief was making him paranoid. Frank was his best friend, his only friend. He was just trying to protect him. That's what Frank always did. Back in the quiet sanctuary of his workshop, the familiar smells of sawdust and oil did nothing to soothe him. The world was muted, its colors washed out. All the small joys he had found in his work, the satisfaction of a perfect joint, the smoothness of a sanded piece of wood, they were gone. It was all just motion. Empty motion. He began to pack away the few things he had brought back from his trip. A small bag of Vietnamese coffee. A little lacquer box he'd bought at a market. He didn't want the reminders. He wanted to bury it all again. Deeper this time. He wanted to return to the numb, manageable piece of his old life. His hand brushed against an old leather-bound photo album on a dusty shelf. an album he hadn't opened in years. On impulse, he pulled it down. He blew a layer of fine sawdust from its cover. He opened it. The pictures were of them. Him and Frank, young and impossibly lean in their marine dress blues, grinning foolishly for the camera on graduation day from boot camp. Him and Frank, covered in mud and grime somewhere in the jungle, sharing a can of sea rations, Frank making a stupid face that had, for a moment, made him forget the fear. Picture after picture. A chronicle of a friendship forged in the crucible of war. He stopped at one. A picture of them on R&R in Bangkok. They were sitting at an outdoor bar, beers in their hands, looking tired but happy. As he looked at Frank's younger face, a memory surfaced. Not a memory from the war. A memory from 2 days ago. He was on the veranda with Mai. They were talking about the little boy, about the fever. She had looked out at the sea, her expression one of profound, weary resignation. And she had said, in English, "It is Wooded Island?" The phrase. It was a common enough phrase. A simple statement of acceptance for a reality that cannot be changed. But the way she had said it, the exact inflection, the slight, world-weary shrug of her shoulders that had accompanied it. It was Frank's. It was Frank's phrase. It was the line he had used his entire life, for every unchangeable, unfortunate situation. A bad poker hand, a broken-down car, a friend's failed marriage. Hey, it is Wooded Island. A cold dread, a feeling colder and sharper than any grief, began to creep up John's spine. How? How would a Vietnamese woman, a woman who had, by her own account, never left her small coastal village after the war, know Frank Kowalski's favorite idiom, and say it with his exact signature inflection? It wasn't possible. His mind began to race, tumbling backwards, re-examining every detail, every conversation, the letter, who had sent it. It had no return address, just a postmark. It was the thing that had started it all, the miraculous catalyst. But why now? Why, after 50 years of silence, would someone send that letter? Unless the sender knew something would be found, something that would end the search for good, like a grave. He thought of the phone call from the airport, the sharp intake of breath, the long-waited silence. It wasn't just the silence of sympathy. It was the silence of a man on a wire, holding his breath, waiting to see if his story, his lie, had held. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked around his workshop, this place of peace he had built. He saw the half-finished birdhouse on the workbench. He saw the photograph of Mai and their son, still lying where he'd left it. He saw it all, his entire life, through a new, terrifying lens. Frank hadn't been protecting him from a scam. Frank hadn't been trying to save him from chasing ghosts. Frank had been hiding one. The drive to Frank's house was a drive through a nightmare. John didn't remember getting into his old Ford pickup. He didn't remember pulling out of his driveway. His hands were on the wheel, his foot was on the gas pedal. But he was an automaton, a machine piloted by a single terrifying thought, a thought that was circling his mind like a vulture. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The familiar suburban streets of his neighborhood, the tidy lawns, the cheerful mailboxes, the kids riding their bikes, it all looked like a movie set. A flimsy painted backdrop designed to hide a terrible, rotting truth. Frank lived 15 minutes away. 15 minutes that stretched into an eternity. With every passing stoplight, with every turn of the wheel, the evidence mounted in his mind. It was a cascade of small, forgotten details that now, suddenly, blazed with a new and horrific meaning. Frank's reluctance to ever talk about Mai, which John had always mistaken for a respectful silence for his friend's grief. Frank's subtle, constant discouragement over the years of any attempt John made to search, always framed as a gentle, protective concern. It'll only bring you more pain, Johnny. Some things are better left buried. Even the money. Frank had always been generous. When John's workshop was struggling in the early years, Frank had won big at the track, and given him a loan he never asked to be repaid. Where had that money come from? The pieces were slotting into place, forming a picture so monstrous, so unthinkable, that his mind recoiled from it. He pulled up to Frank's house. It was a tidy, single-story suburban home, the kind of place that speaks of a life of quiet, unassuming contentment. A perfectly manicured lawn, edged with military precision. A pristine American flag hanging from the porch, motionless in the still, late afternoon air. The sheer suffocating normality of it all was an obscene contrast to the chaos raging inside John's head. He saw him in the backyard, through the slats of the fence. Frank was standing at a large stainless steel gas grill, a spatula in one hand, a can of beer in the other. He was wearing a ridiculous apron that said "License to Grill." He was humming to himself. The picture of a man at peace with his world. John didn't go to the front door. He walked around the side of the house, his boots silent on the soft grass, and unlatched the gate to the backyard. The click of the latch was unnaturally loud in the quiet air. Frank turned, and a wide, easy smile spread across his face when he saw John. It was the same smile John had seen 1,000 times. The smile of a brother. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice full of genuine warmth. "Good to have you back. I was just about to call you. Figured you could use a burger and a beer. A real one." He gestured with the spatula. "Sit down. Relax. You've been through hell." John didn't sit. He just stood there, by the gate, watching his best friend. He watched the easy way Frank moved, the comfortable confidence in his posture. And for the first time in 50 years, he saw him not as a brother, but as a stranger. A complete and utter stranger. Frank's smile began to falter under John's silent, intense gaze. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "Johnny, you okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Why, Frank?" John's voice was quiet, deadly quiet. It cut through the peaceful backyard air like a shard of glass. Frank's face tensed. He put the spatula down on the side table of the grill. "What are you talking about? Why? What?" John took a slow step forward, then another. He was closing the distance between them, collapsing the 50 years of comfortable friendship into a few charged feet of green lawn. "You told me she was dead," he said, his voice still a low, dangerous monotone. "In Guam. You looked me in the eye, and you told me she was killed in a firefight. Why?" Frank's face went pale, a sickly, grayish color. He shook his head, trying to force a look of confused denial. "John, that's what I heard. That was the intel on the ground. It was chaos back then, you know that. Information was—" "And why?" John interrupted, his voice rising now, gaining a hard, serrated edge. He took another step. They were only a few feet apart now. He could smell the beer on Frank's breath, the faint, greasy smell of the grilling burgers. "Why did you tell her that I was dead?" The name. He hadn't said her name. He hadn't needed to. And in that moment, the lie died. It didn't die with a bang. It died with a quiet, pathetic whimper. The color drained completely from Frank's face. His carefully constructed mask of concern, of friendship, of brotherly love. It didn't just crack. It disintegrated. It crumbled away, revealing the terrified, guilty face of a thief who had just been caught. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The denial he was about to offer withered on his tongue. The confession that followed, it wasn't a clean, single statement. It was a torrent. A 50-year flood of jealousy, of resentment, of a quiet, corrosive bitterness that had been poisoning their friendship from the very beginning. It all came pouring out. A lifetime of living in John's shadow. John, the natural leader. John, the one the other guys always looked up to. John, the one who had gotten the girl. "I loved her too, Johnny." Frank finally choked out, his voice a broken, pathetic thing. "From the first time I saw her. But she only ever had eyes for you. She looked at you like you were the Sunday. And I was just nothing." He had seen his chance in the chaos of the evacuation. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It was so easy. A lie to him, a lie to her. 2 clean surgical cuts, separating them forever. He had played the part of the grieving, supportive friend to perfection. He had been John's rock, all while being the architect of his lifelong sorrow. John felt the ground give way beneath him. The betrayal was so absolute, so total. It was a physical sensation. A void opening up inside him, swallowing 50 years of trust, of shared history, of brotherhood. But there was still one more piece, the most important piece. "But the boy," John whispered, the name a painful rasp in his throat. "Hung. Mai showed me the grave, Frank. I saw it. The headstone." Frank finally looked him in the eye. And, in the depths of his best friend's eyes, John saw not a brother, not a soldier, but a thief. The worst kind of thief. A thief of lives. "There is no grave, John." The words were quiet, but they were the most violent thing John had ever heard. Frank took a deep, shuddering breath, the confession now a runaway train he couldn't stop. "I needed you to stop looking. I needed it to be over. For good." He looked away at the perfectly manicured lawn, at the tidy suburban world he had built on this monstrous lie. "After I told Mai you were dead, she was broken. She had nothing, no one. I convinced her that the only way for the boy to have a future, a real life, was in America. With me." He paused, gathering the last of his courage to deliver the final, killing blow. "I adopted him, John. I forged the papers. I brought him home." John felt his legs buckle. He reached out and grabbed the back of a patio chair to keep from falling. The world was spinning, a nauseating gray blur. The sounds of the neighborhood, a dog barking in the distance, the faint laughter of children, they sounded like they were coming from another planet. His son wasn't dead, his son was alive. He had been alive all this time, living, breathing, growing up, just a few miles away. He looked at the man he had called his brother, this stranger, this monster. "Where is he, Frank?" John's voice was a choked, guttural sound, barely human. "Where is my son?" Frank's voice was barely a whisper. The sound of a man who had finally been unburdened of a secret that had crushed him for 50 years. He lives 2 towns over, in Northwood." Frank finally looked back at John, his eyes swimming with a pathetic, useless plea for a forgiveness he would never receive. "His name is David. David Kowalski. He's a firefighter, he has a wife, and 2 kids. Your grandchildren." The park was neutral ground. That was the only word John could think of for it. It was a small, quiet patch of green halfway between his town and Northwood. A place with no history, no memories, no ghosts. It had a small duck pond, a weathered wooden gazebo, and a few scattered benches under the shade of ancient, sprawling oak trees. It was a place where nothing had ever happened. And now, everything was about to happen here. John arrived early. He couldn't stay in his house. The walls of his workshop, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison cell built by Frank's lies. He sat on a bench facing the pond, watching the ducks glide across the water's surface, their movements serene and untroubled. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves in the trees above him. The world was pretending to be peaceful. It felt like a mockery. He didn't know what to expect. What does a father say to a son he has never met? A son who doesn't even know he exists. The words he had rehearsed in his mind, they were all useless. Pathetic. They were the lines from a bad movie. "I'm your father." The phrase felt obscene, presumptuous. He hadn't earned the right to say it. He saw them arrive. 2 cars. Frank's familiar sedan pulled into the small parking lot first. Then a larger American-made SUV pulled in beside it. A firefighter's car, a family man's car. Frank got out first. He looked diminished. Smaller than John had ever seen him. The confident, easy swagger of the man who had stood at a barbecue just 2 days ago was gone, replaced by the stooped, shuffling gait of a condemned man. He didn't look at John. He just stood by his car, waiting. Then the driver's side door of the SUV opened, and a man got out. John's breath caught in his throat. It was like looking at a ghost. But it wasn't the ghost of his son, the little boy from the photographs. It was the ghost of himself, the ghost of the young man he had been 50 years ago. The man was in his early 50s, but he carried himself with the solid, grounded strength of someone who deals with life and death for a living. He had a strong, steady build, broad shoulders that spoke of years of physical work. His hair was darker than John's had ever been, but it was thick and full. But his eyes, they were John's eyes. That same shade of gray, that same serious, steady, unflinching gaze. Seeing them in another man's face, a face that was both a stranger's and his own, was a dizzying, gut-wrenching experience. The man's name was David Kowalski. He looked from Frank to the aging stranger sitting on the park bench. His face was a storm of conflicting emotions. John could see the deep, ingrained respect and love he had for the man he knew as his father. But he could also see a dawning, terrible confusion. A sense of a world that was suddenly, inexplicably, out of alignment. Frank said something to him, his voice too low for John to hear. David just nodded, his expression grim. Then, he began to walk toward the bench. Each step was deliberate, measured. The walk of a man heading into a fire, not knowing what he would find inside. John's heart was a wild, frantic bird beating against the cage of his ribs. He felt an irrational urge to run, to get back in his truck and drive away, to leave this impossible situation behind, and return to the simple, uncomplicated grief he had lived with for 50 years. But he didn't run. He had been running his whole life. He forced himself to stay seated. He forced himself to meet his son's eyes. David stopped a few feet from the bench. He didn't speak. He just looked. He was studying John's face, searching for something, a resemblance, an explanation, an answer to a question he hadn't even known to ask until an hour ago. Frank stood off to the side, about 20 yards away. A broken, solitary figure, a ghost at a reunion he had no right to attend. He was giving them space, or perhaps he was just a coward. The silence stretched. It was a profound, earth-shattering silence, filled with the weight of 50 stolen years. It was a silence filled with questions that had no easy answers. Finally, David spoke, and his voice, it was steady, calm. The voice of a man trained to be calm in the face of chaos. "My dad," he began, his voice rough around the edges. He told me a story. I'm having a hard time believing it." John knew then that there were no speeches to be made. There were no explanations that could possibly bridge this chasm. Words were useless. They were just air. All he had was the truth. The tangible, physical truth. Slowly, his trembling hand reached into his jacket pocket. The same pocket that had held the letter that started it all. He pulled out the two things he had carried with him across the ocean. The two things that were real. First, the faded photograph of the young woman in the whiteout dye. He held it out. "This was your mother," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Her name was Mai." David took the photograph. He looked down at the image of the beautiful, smiling girl he had never known. John could see his throat working, a man struggling to control a lifetime of buried emotion that was now rushing to the surface. Then, John opened his other hand. Lying in his wrinkled, calloused palm was the small, dark, hand-carved wooden bird. The polish was gone, worn away by 50 years of being held in a grieving man's hand. "She gave this to me," John said softly, "the day I left. She said she wanted you to have a good life." David looked from the bird to John's face, and in his eyes, in those gray eyes that were a mirror of his own, John saw the last wall of disbelief crumble. A man can be lied to. A story can be a fabrication. But a father's eyes and a mother's last gift, those things do not lie. David reached out, and his firefighter's hands, which were so large and strong, surprisingly gentle, and he took the bird from John's palm. He closed his own fingers around it. He stood there for a long moment, holding the first and only thing his mother had ever given him. There were no Hollywood tears. There was no dramatic, cathartic embrace. There was only this: a quiet park, a setting Sunday, two strangers, a father and a son, bound by a history of loss and lies, and a third man, the architect of it all, watching from a distance, a ghost in his own life. It wasn't an ending. It wasn't a neat, tidy resolution that could be wrapped up with a bow. It was the painful, awkward, and utterly uncertain beginning of something new. It was the first, terrifying step onto a long, uncharted road of trying to reclaim a legacy from the ashes of a 50-year-old betrayal. The fire and smoke of Vietnam. They had been the defining elements of John Callahan's life for 50 years. They weren't just memories. They were a presence, a constant, unseen companion. The fire was the searing heat of his grief, the burning shame of a promise he had failed to keep. The smoke was the gray, obscuring haze of the years that followed, a life lived in the shadow of a colossal, defining loss. It was a legacy of absence, a legacy of endings. But now, standing in the quiet, fading light of a suburban park, a new legacy was beginning. It wasn't being forged in the heat of battle, but in the profound, earth-shattering silence between a father and a son who were strangers. The months that followed that first, impossible meeting were a delicate, painful dance. They were an exercise in archaeology, two men trying to excavate the ruins of a shared history they had never been allowed to have. There were no easy moments. There was no sudden, miraculous bond. There was only effort. A slow, tentative, and often clumsy effort to build a bridge across a 50-year chasm of lies. They met for coffee. In diners just like the one where John had always met with Frank. The first few times, the silence was a heavy, suffocating thing. It was filled with all the things they couldn't say, the questions David was afraid to ask, the apologies John didn't know how to give. They talked about safe things, John's woodworking, David's job at the fire station, the weather. They were like two men from different countries, with no shared language, trying to communicate through gestures and simple declarative sentences. Slowly, painstakingly, a foundation was laid. John learned about his son's life, not as a concept, but as a reality. He learned that David had been a good kid, quiet, serious, and a little bit lost, always feeling like a piece of his own story was missing. He learned that David had his mother's kindness and his father's steady hands. He had used those hands not to build birdhouses, but to save lives, to pull people from burning buildings, to bring a quiet, steady calm to the most chaotic of situations. John felt a surge of pride so fierce, so powerful. It was a physical ache in his chest. And David, he learned about John. He learned about a young Marine who had fallen in love in the middle of a war. He learned about a promise made in terror and hope. He saw the faded photographs John had kept. And for the first time, he saw his mother, Mai, not as an abstract idea, but as a real, vibrant, smiling young woman. He began to understand the shape of the hole that had been in his own life and the even larger one that had been in his father's. And Frank was a ghost. John never saw him again. After that day in the park, Frank had simply vanished from his life. He'd sold his house, moved away, without a word. There was no confrontation, no final, cathartic reckoning. John realized, with a quiet, weary sadness, that there was nothing left to say. The betrayal was too absolute. It had incinerated 50 years of friendship, leaving not even ash behind. There was only an empty space where his brother had once been. The true healing, the real beginning, came not with David, but with his children. David's wife, a warm, kind woman named Sarah, had invited John over for dinner one Sunday. John had been terrified. The idea of stepping into this life, this family that had been built without him, felt like an intrusion. But he went. He walked into a house filled with the cheerful, chaotic noise of a family, the smell of roasting chicken, the sound of a television in the background, and the laughter of his grandchildren. There were two of them. A boy, Liam, who was 10 years old and had his father's serious, steady gaze, and a little girl, Mia, who was 6. Mia had her grandmother's eyes. When John saw her, This little girl with the dark, expressive eyes of the woman he had lost 50 years ago. His carefully constructed composure finally, completely, shattered. He sat down on their comfortable sofa, and he wept. He didn't make a sound. Silent tears just streamed down his wrinkled face. Tears of sorrow for the grandmother she would never know. Tears of gratitude for the miracle that she was here. And tears of a joy so profound and overwhelming. It felt like pain. The little girl, with the simple, uncomplicated empathy of a child, just came over, patted his arm awkwardly, and offered him her half-eaten cookie. And in that small, simple gesture, the 50-year winter in John Callahan's soul finally began to thaw. The fire and smoke of Vietnam had defined him. They had been his story, but now, the legacy was changing. It was the hesitant, questioning smile of his son across a diner table. It was the solid, reassuring weight of his 10-year-old grandson's arm on his shoulder as they worked on a model airplane together in his workshop. It was the sound of his granddaughter's laughter, high and clear as a bell, as he pushed her on a swing in that same quiet park where it had all begun. The past could never be erased. The scar of Frank's deception would always be there, a pale, jagged line across the landscape of his life. The ghost of Mai would always walk with him. But these things were no longer the end of his story. They were just the beginning of it. One afternoon, about a year after he had come home from Vietnam for the second and final time, John was in his workshop. Liam was there with him, carefully sanding a piece of wood for a new birdhouse they were building together. The air was filled with the familiar, peaceful smells of sawdust and varnish. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating the floating dust motes in golden shafts of light. He looked at his grandson, this boy who was a part of him, and a part of David, and a part of Mai. He saw the concentration on his young face, the steady movement of his hands, and he felt a sense of peace. So deep, so complete, it felt like grace. He was no longer a man haunted by ghosts. He was no longer defined by what he had lost. He was a father. He was a grandfather. He was a man whose legacy was no longer one of smoke and ashes and absence. It was a legacy of quiet, resilient, and enduring life. A small, steady flame, passed on to a new generation. Finally, miraculously, reclaimed. The deepest secrets are often kept by those we trust the most. For more stories that uncover the hidden truths of our past, subscribe to Echoes of the Past and join us on the journey.